I stepped out of Sarah's Range Rover, my fingers tightly gripping the heavy manila envelope. Ever since we left Arthur Pendleton's law office, I had been pressing it against my palm, half convinced that if I let go, it would just vanish into thin air. 15 pages of dense legal documents, a century-old historic mansion in San Francisco's Pacific Heights, and $15 million in tax-free municipal bonds. Every single line prominently featured my Aunt Margaret's name, and right next to it mine. On the drive back, I read through the paperwork 3 times, but my body still felt weightless, like I couldn't quite contain the sheer gravity of what had just happened. When I woke up that morning, I was just an ordinary housewife doing her usual Tuesday routine, sorting through her husband's dry cleaning suits. Now, I didn't know what I had become, but I could feel a transformation happening. It was a sense of profound, grounded security that I hadn't felt in years. I looked up. Richard was standing right there in the driveway of our Palo Alto home, with his brother and business partner Thomas right by his side. They were both wearing perfectly tailored suits, looking stiff, deliberate, and on high alert, as if they were attending some major corporate event. Richard held a stack of papers in his hand, leaning his weight forward slightly with his chin tilted up. I've been married to this man for 14 years, and I know every single detail of his body language. That stance meant only one thing. He was absolutely certain he had already won. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 52 years old, and the afternoon I'm about to describe to you is the exact moment everything Aunt Margaret had set in motion for me finally came to light. If you are watching this story from a place where you deeply understand what it truly costs to be patient, please drop a comment below. I really want to know where you're listening from. I didn't slow down, and I didn't pick up my pace. I walked straight toward them at the exact steady speed I always used when approaching that front door, holding the envelope firmly in my hand. I watched Richard's eyes dart past me, landing on the car behind me, Sarah's Range Rover, a vehicle he had never seen before. Before he could mask his reaction, I caught a brief flicker of genuine confusion on his face. He didn't hide it fast enough. "Eleanor," he said, using that specific low tone of voice men use when they want to dictate the energy of a room. Then, he held out the papers in his hand. "I need you to look at this." It was a property division and emergency divorce agreement. I knew exactly what it was before my fingers even touched the paper. The cover page bore the letterhead of a law firm I didn't recognize, with my full name printed in bold, looking less like a document and more like a final judgment. Richard kept talking. His voice was controlled, carrying that soft, polite veneer he always used when he was being his most ruthless. He told me that our co-owned winery in Napa Valley had been put up as collateral, that liquidation proceedings for a bridge loan had already begun, and that his venture capital firm was facing bankruptcy. He claimed that to protect me from being dragged into the corporate debt, I needed to immediately sign this agreement, waiving my rights to the remaining equity in the winery. He told me he had already taken care of everything. He said that last phrase as if he were doing me a massive favor. Thomas didn't say a single word the entire time. He didn't have to. Standing just 2 feet to Richard's left, arms crossed with a cold, detached look in his eyes, his silence in that driveway was the loudest declaration of war possible. I looked down at the divorce papers, I looked at Richard, then I looked at Thomas. And then I laughed. It wasn't a quick chuckle, or a nervous, anxious giggle. It was a deep, grounded laugh that came from the absolute core of who I am, a place that these 2 men had spent the last 14 years trying and failing to break. Richard's calm facade finally cracked. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible shift, but it was enough. "What's so funny?" he asked. I stared at him for a long, quiet moment. Then I said, "Actually, that winery you just said you were liquidating? It belongs to—" I paused, carefully folding the divorce agreement with both hands, and slid it into my Birkin bag right next to the envelope Arthur had given me. "My lawyer will be in touch." I turned around, walked back down the driveway, opened the door to Sarah's car, and got back in, pulling the door shut behind me. Sarah didn't say a word as she pulled away from the curb. It wasn't until we had driven 3 blocks away that she finally spoke. "Eleanor, what on earth just happened back there?" My eyes stayed glued to the road ahead. The envelope was sitting on my lap, the wax seal from Arthur's firm pressing against my fingers. Everything Aunt Margaret had promised me. The morning had started out like most life-altering days do, completely ordinary, quiet, and without a single warning sign. Arthur Pendleton's office sat on the top floor of a historic building on Montgomery Street. The air inside smelled like old paper and central air conditioning. The room featured dark mahogany paneling, heavy beige curtains that hadn't been changed in 2 decades, and a grandfather clock ticking away in the corner. That ticking sound was loud enough to fill the suffocating silence between a room full of people who all had their own hidden agendas. Arthur sat behind his massive desk, holding Aunt Margaret's will in both hands. His reading glasses had slid down to the tip of his nose, and his expression was completely unreadable. There were 6 people in the room. Sarah sat right next to me, and across the long table sat my 2 cousins, David and Chloe. They sat there with that distinct, entitled stillness of people who believed they were moments away from collecting their rightful share. There was also a financial advisor who had known my aunt for decades. As for me, I just kept my hands folded in my lap, focusing entirely on keeping my breathing steady. Arthur read slowly. He always read slowly. I think he genuinely believed that every single word deserved the time it took to sink in. The first few bequests were standard: sentimental jewelry, small trust funds. When he read Chloe's name and announced a number that was clearly far less than she expected, she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. David didn't say anything, but the sharp tightening of his jaw was a look I knew all too well. It was the exact expression he had worn since childhood whenever things didn't go his way. Then Arthur reached my name. He paused for a brief moment. He began to read. The $15 million in tax-free municipal bonds, the historic estate in Pacific Heights with full title ownership, and the controlling interest in all remaining commercial real estate under the name of Margaret Vance are to be inherited completely and unconditionally by her niece, Eleanor Vance, effective upon the conclusion of the probate process. Underneath the table, Sarah grabbed my hand so hard my knuckles pressed painfully together. I didn't move an inch. For a second, I think I actually stopped breathing. Chloe's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she stood up. "This can't be right," she said, her voice low but cutting through the room like a knife. "There has to be a mistake. Aunt Margaret would never—" Arthur looked up from the paperwork. "There is no mistake," he said, his tone carrying the finality of a heavy door slamming shut. It was locked. This will was drafted, reviewed, and executed with full legal authority. It is not open to debate in this room. David stood up next. He and Chloe walked out of the room without looking at me once. I watched them leave in total silence. I noticed the tense, rigid posture of Chloe's shoulders, and I made a quiet mental note of it. Once the room cleared out, Arthur asked me to stay behind. He leaned back in his chair, interlacing his fingers. "Your aunt came to see me 18 months ago," he said. "Before any medical reports came back, before any of this happened, she sat right in the chair you're sitting in now. She told me exactly what she wanted to do and exactly why she wanted to do it." He paused. "She was a woman who did nothing without a reason, Eleanor. You know that." "Of course I knew that." "She also left you something that wasn't included in the official will." He slid an envelope across the desk toward me. On the front, written in Aunt Margaret's distinct, elegant, and sharp handwriting, was my name. Arthur excused himself from the room, and while Sarah waited for me out in the hallway, I sat alone in that quiet office and opened my aunt's letter. I won't tell you everything that letter said just yet. It isn't time for that. But I can tell you this. The moment I finished reading it, something tight inside my chest finally let go. It didn't shatter. It just unwound. It felt like a stubborn knot that had finally received the right amount of pressure in the exact right place. I sat there holding that letter for a long time. Margaret had seen right through a corner of my life that I had never spoken out loud to a soul. And 18 months ago, long before I even realized it myself, she had written down the answer for me in black and white. I folded the letter, placed it in my bag alongside the legal documents, and walked out to find Sarah waiting. I asked her to drive me home. I wanted to tell Richard myself. I wanted to watch his face when he heard the news. I had absolutely no idea what kind of trap had already been set for me in that driveway. On the day I married Richard, Aunt Margaret didn't walk me down the aisle, but she gave my hand a heavy, meaningful squeeze right before the ceremony. It was firm, the exact habit she had whenever there was something she wanted to say, but couldn't put into words. At the time, I thought it was just the emotion of the day. I was 38, completely full of certainty, and I assumed it was just a stern woman trying to hold back tears at her niece's wedding. I look back at that handshake completely differently now. Richard possessed the kind of effortless charm that captivated people in public, As the founder of a Silicon Valley venture capital firm, he could work a room, memorize everyone's name in 20 minutes, and leave every single person believing they had just shared the most important conversation of the night. He was a master of appearances. And for a very long time, I mistook that superficial charm for real depth. During our first year together, I noticed small things and tucked them away, convincing myself they didn't matter. I noticed how he would subtly steer conversations away from my professional insights. I noticed how he would make final decisions regarding our shared assets first, and then mention them to me in passing later, rather than consulting me beforehand. These were the kinds of things you tell yourself are just normal adjustments to marriage, rather than a calculated pattern. By the third year, Richard suggested I step down from my position as a senior partner at a top architectural firm. His company was going through a massive expansion phase, and he told me he needed someone to manage our properties across the country and host our formal dinner parties. He made it sound completely logical, which was exactly how he made the most unreasonable demands sound like absolute common sense. I had over a decade of experience in urban planning and architectural design, and I had a team that relied on me completely. But I walked away anyway, giving it up without a fight, simply because he asked and because I truly believed we were building a perfect marriage together. I stopped calling my former colleagues. My social circle gradually shrank without any single dramatic event triggering it. The Sunday brunches and long phone calls with Aunt Margaret became fewer and farther between. Richard felt uncomfortable around her sharp wit, and whenever her name came up too often in the house, the atmosphere turned incredibly tense. I learned how to make myself small. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, gradual shift. It's like adapting to a room that is slowly losing its heat, where you don't even realize how freezing the temperature has become until you can finally see your own breath. Then came year 5. I tried to get back into the workforce. A top design institute in San Francisco had an opening for a director position, and I was completely qualified, practically overqualified. During dinner one evening, I brought it up to Richard. He looked at me, his eyes showing absolutely no amusement and zero sympathy. Before he could even respond, Thomas, Richard's brother and his chief financial officer, who happened to be over for dinner that night, spoke up. He looked right at me and said, "Richard's company is at a critical juncture with their Series C funding, Eleanor. This really isn't the time for you to be creating distractions." He said it with total certainty, as if he were confirming a done deal. Richard didn't say a single word to correct him. The very next morning, I withdrew my application. I replayed that dinner in my mind thousands of times. I stayed because I genuinely believed people should honor their commitments. I kept telling myself that the empty, hollow phases in a marriage were just temporary. Then we hit year 13. A change came over Richard, one that was so quiet it was almost impossible to catch if you weren't paying close attention. He started shifting our financial structures, talking about merging trust accounts that I had never been consulted on. He took complete control over all the complex financial paperwork. At first, that behavior felt protective, until I finally realized it wasn't protection at all. It was a calculated setup. He started carefully asking about Aunt Margaret, questioning her estate and how her assets were structured. I thought he was just being practical. I thought he was planning for our future. He was definitely planning, but I wasn't part of the plan. So, the confrontation in the driveway didn't shock me the way he thought it would. What truly made me see through everything was the timing. This was happening on the exact same day I went to the reading of the will. He had been watching Aunt Margaret all along. He had been waiting for the perfect moment. The second he thought the door was wide open, he made his move. But there was one major detail Richard failed to account for. When I laughed out loud in that driveway, I looked directly at Thomas's face. What I saw there wasn't confusion. It was absolute terror. A quiet, suppressed, primal fear. He never expected me to laugh. He had built their entire plan on the absolute certainty that I would break down and sob. That fear told me he knew far more about what was happening behind the scenes than he let on, and it also told me he realized instantly just how terribly they had miscalculated. Sarah drove for 3 blocks before she finally spoke again. "Eleanor, talk to me." My hand was already deep inside my bag, not looking for answers, but reaching for Arthur Pendleton's business card. I found it right underneath the envelope, and I dialed the number before Sarah could even finish her sentence. He picked up on the second ring. "Arthur," I said, my voice dropping lower than I expected. It was completely steady but low. I just got home and Richard was waiting for me in the driveway. Emergency divorce papers. He claims the Napa Valley winery has been leveraged as collateral and liquidation has already started. He wants me to sign a waiver immediately to keep me from being held liable. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. It wasn't the kind of silence where someone is struggling to process information. It was the silence of a man who fully grasped the gravity of what he was hearing and was carefully choosing his next words. "Get back to my office," he said, "right now." I looked over at Sarah. "Turn around." She didn't ask a single question or waste any time. She just made a U-turn. That's exactly the kind of woman my sister is. When we walked back in, Arthur was standing up. He wasn't behind his desk. He was standing right beside it, something I had never seen him do before. He gestured for me to sit in the chair across from him, waiting until I was settled before he spoke. "You need to understand two things right now," he said. First, the Pacific Heights property and the municipal bonds have not finished the transfer process. The will has only just entered probate. Richard knows absolutely nothing about it, has zero connection to it, and has no legal claim to a single brick of that estate. No matter what he thinks he knows about your aunt's assets, he is completely in the dark about these two things. I nodded. "Second," he said, sitting down and turning his computer screen toward me. "This is the property record system for Marin County, California. This is the current title status for your co-owned winery in Napa Valley. The exact property Richard just told you was used as collateral for a loan. In the state of California, if a commercial property is considered marital asset, placing a multi-million-dollar lien on it requires the signatures of both owners. Two people, Eleanor, not one." I leaned forward, focusing on the screen. In the borrower column of the loan documents, the names read Eleanor Vance and Richard Vance. There, in plain sight, was my electronic signature and a notary stamp. "Richard handled all of the financial documents in our marriage," I said. "I never had a single reason to check the property records myself." "I know." Arthur's voice remained perfectly level, which usually meant one of two things. Either the mortgage loan hadn't legally gone through yet, and he was using threats to force me out before liquidation, or the transaction involved forged signatures and a fraudulent notary stamp. "Either way," he continued, printing out the page and sliding it across the desk to me. "Under California law and federal wire fraud statutes, he is in massive trouble." I picked up the printed record with both hands. For 14 years, I had handed every single document over to him. For 14 years, I truly believed that a shared life meant shared honesty. And now, my name was printed right there, completely frozen in a place it never should have been. This proved that the confidence Richard showed in the driveway was either a massive bluff, a crime, or a mix of both. Looking down at that paper, what I felt wasn't anger. To describe it precisely, it was a profound sense of certainty. It was that incredibly clear, sharp clarity a woman gets when her intuition is finally validated by a piece of paper. Arthur crossed his hands over the desk. "You need a lawyer who specializes in high-net-worth divorces and white-collar fraud. Someone who knows exactly how to fight this on two fronts simultaneously, both in family court and federal court." He paused for a moment. "I have the perfect person in mind." He picked up the phone and dialed. I sat across from him, listening as he spoke in his usual calm, deliberate manner. When he hung up, he looked straight at me. "Evelyn Chow, Financial District in San Francisco. We're meeting her tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. I didn't know the name at the time. I had no idea what that name was about to mean for Richard Vance. I nodded, and for the very first time since leaving that private driveway, I smiled. It wasn't the smile Richard had seen. That smile was for him. This smile was entirely for myself. Before the woman even spoke a single word, her office told me everything I needed to know. It sat on the top floor of the Transamerica Pyramid, a corner office with a view that overlooked the entire San Francisco Bay. Every single surface was immaculate, showing a sharp, deliberate edge rather than casual habit. Files were perfectly in place, and there wasn't a single useless decoration in sight. Right in the middle of the wall behind her desk hung a single framed license, perfectly level. It wasn't a wall meant to show off credentials. It was a silent statement that she had been in this field long enough to only need that one piece of paper. Evelyn Chow stood up the moment I walked in. She was tall, poised, and somewhere in her late 50s, carrying a distinct stillness that didn't come from a place of peace. That stillness came from absolute control over every single room she walked into. She shook my hand once, gestured for me to take the chair across from her desk, and sat down. "Arthur called me last night," she said. "I've already started moving things forward." She listened to my entire story without writing down a single word. No notepad, no pen, no audio recorder. There were only her eyes locked onto mine, her hands folded on her desk, absorbing every word I said like she was collecting an item she fully intended to use as a weapon. When I finished talking, she stayed quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she started asking questions. Her first question was, "In the past 6 months, have you signed any documents regarding asset transfers or loans that Richard handed to you?" "No," I replied. Her second question followed, "Are you still listed on any of the joint financial accounts Richard recently moved or closed?" "I don't know. He handled all of that completely." She nodded, treating that response as a definitive answer in itself. Her third question took a completely different turn. She looked straight at me and asked, "When did you know this marriage was effectively over?" "Year 9, I said, but I stayed anyway." The expression on her face shifted slightly, an almost unnoticeable change. It wasn't sympathy, it was something far more useful, validation. She picked up a pen, wrote 4 quick lines on her notepad, turned it around and pushed it across the desk toward me. "Wire fraud, forgery, intentional dissipation of marital assets, conspiracy." She drew a line underneath all 4 terms. "These are the directions this could go," she said, "not the final conclusions. Right now, I have questions, not answers." Then, she tapped the tip of her pen against the first 2 words. "The private equity firm handling this mortgage loan issued a $5 million line of credit without doing a rigorous verification of dual ownership," she noted. "Whether that constitutes negligence, a violation of protocol, or something much worse remains to be seen. I don't have their internal records yet. I haven't heard their explanation. What I have right now is a highly suspicious transaction." Her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at it, then looked back up at me. "My litigation assistant. We've already started pulling all public filings and property trust records." She looked at the screen and read, "The $5 million bridge loan hasn't been fully transferred to an offshore account yet. There is a pending liquidation date." She set her phone down. "We have 9 days." For the very first time, I saw a look bordering on satisfaction flash across her face. "That is more than enough time for us to find out exactly what happened." I asked her directly then, because I needed to hear the plain truth, what the absolute best-case scenario would look like. This time she paused. "The honest answer," she said, "is that I need to see all the evidence before making any promises." I nodded. She continued, "But if the documents support what you just told me, then the mortgage loan can be overturned. The flow of funds can be frozen. If handwriting experts and digital forensics confirm that the signatures and notary stamps were forged, the consequences they will face will extend far beyond the jurisdiction of a divorce court." It was a cautious answer, a lawyer's answer, but somehow it gave me much more confidence than absolute certainty ever could. I stood up, and she stood up right along with me. "There's one more thing." Her tone hadn't changed. It never did, but the sheer weight behind her voice made me pause mid-stride. "In 22 years of handling high-net-worth divorces and fraud cases in this city, I've learned something. The cases that strike the deepest, most fatal blows to a betraying spouse are almost always the ones where the other partner remains absolutely, perfectly calm." She locked her eyes onto mine. "Don't lose your composure." I grabbed my bag, walked out of her office, took the elevator downstairs, and stepped into the foggy San Francisco morning. I already felt like a woman who had won. I just needed to wait for the legal process to catch up to my reality. When I called Clara to tell her I was heading over, she already had a meal ready. That's just who she is. She doesn't wait for people to tell her when something is wrong. She can sense the undercurrents through some invisible thread that connects the 2 of us. So she simply goes into the kitchen and starts cooking. Roasted chicken, sourdough stuffing, and something simmering on the stove that smelled exactly like her grandmother's house in Berkeley, which is to say, it smelled like safety. I sat down at her kitchen table, and for the first time in 4 days, I let out a full, deep breath. I told her everything. The reading of the will, Arthur's office, the staggering numbers, Aunt Margaret's letter, the confrontation in the driveway. I described Richard standing there like a debt collector, Thomas's cold indifference, the divorce papers, and that laugh I couldn't fully explain. I told her about Evelyn Chow, the 9-day countdown, and those 4 words written on the notepad. I laid it all out in chronological order, keeping my voice completely even. Clara just listened. the way she always does, without any performance of worry or rushing to piece together words of comfort while I was still talking. She was just there, completely, quietly present. When I finished, she didn't say anything right away. She stood up, poured us both a glass of California Pinot Noir, set my glass down in front of me, and sat back down. She crossed her hands on the table and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Something I should have told you years ago." I waited. 3 years ago, at that dinner party hosted by your old colleagues from the firm, the one Richard bailed on at the last minute. She paused. "Your Aunt Margaret pulled me outside. Just the two of us, out on the backyard patio. She looked right at me and asked, 'Clara, is Eleanor happy?'" The kitchen went dead silent. I told her the truth. I told her you were just maintaining. You were piecing everything together like you always do, but maintaining and being happy are two completely different things. Anyone paying a modicum of attention could see the difference. She looked down at her hands. She didn't say a single word. She just nodded once and walked back inside the house. I thought I might have overstepped, so I never brought it up again. I sat there letting that sink in for a long time. Aunt Margaret hadn't restructured her entire estate because she had a premonition about getting sick. She did it because of that single conversation on a patio 3 years ago. Because Clara had told her the truth about my life, a truth I couldn't even admit to myself at the time. She got that one honest answer, and she turned it into a historic mansion in Pacific Heights, $15 million in tax-free bonds, and a letter that untied the knot in my chest. She saw right through it before I could even give it a name. Before I could admit it, before I even had the words to describe what my life had become, she saw it, and she laid out a flawless plan. In that moment, I didn't trust my voice, so I stayed silent. Clara let the silence linger. She was good at that. Then she spoke again. "There's one more thing." I looked up. About 6 months ago, I was at a private terminal at SFO. She kept her eyes locked on mine. Richard was there. He was supervising baggage handlers loading massive wooden art crates and luxury luggage onto a Gulfstream. She laid it out plainly without any dramatic flair. Standing right next to him was a younger woman. Eleanor, the way he looked at her, and the way he was directing those assets onto that plane, it definitely wasn't business. And it wasn't just a casual affair. I didn't say anything at the time because I didn't have solid proof, and I didn't want to upset you with something I couldn't verify. She slid a small slip of paper across the table, the name of the private aviation company and the flight dates. I picked it up, pulled out my phone, and before I even stood up from that table, I forwarded the information to Evelyn Chow. Evelyn texted back less than 2 minutes later. The message was just a few words. "Received. This is a major breakthrough." On Monday morning, Evelyn called, and I immediately noticed a shift in her voice. That precise, controlled edge I had grown to recognize meant the scales were finally tipping in our favor. "Come by at noon," she said. "We pulled the private equity firm's records." I arrived at her office by 11:45. The conference table had been cleared off, except for a thick folder sitting right in the center. Evelyn wasn't behind her desk. She was standing right next to that folder. It was the stance she took whenever she wanted me to see something rather than just hear it. She opened the folder and lined the documents up in order. The loan application, the mortgage agreement, the line of credit contract, every single page looked like a brick building an airtight case. "Look at the borrower signature line on each document," she said. I looked. Richard's signature was clear, consistent, and full of confidence on every single page. But on the co-owner signature line, the place where my name was supposed to be, 2 of the documents were completely blank. The third featured an electronic signature and a digital notary stamp. I leaned in closer. "This is supposed to be my signature," I said. "I know." Evelyn's voice was entirely level. My digital forensics and handwriting experts finished their initial review. Based on the verified samples we provided, the stroke path of that digital signature doesn't match your writing habits at all. The pressure patterns are wrong, the spacing is wrong, and the slant is wrong. As for that notary stamp, it was generated using the stolen credentials of an independent notary whose license was revoked last year. She paused. "The expert opinion is absolute. You did not sign this document." I slowly stood up straight. A chill ran through my entire body. It wasn't shock, because underneath it all, I had suspected this all along. It was that bone-chilling cold that comes when a suspicion is finally confirmed in black and white. The head of that shadow lending institution, Evelyn continued, is currently claiming that Richard and Thomas assured him the co-ownership authorization had already been sorted out. His attorney raised that defense with me last week. She pulled a printed email from the bottom of the folder and placed it right on top of the stack. Then I sent him this. I read the email. The sender was Richard, and the recipient was Thomas. The timestamp was 6 weeks before the confrontation in the driveway. The language didn't openly confess to a crime, which was exactly what made it so damning. Richard repeatedly urged Thomas to speed up the funding process, emphasizing that the deal was very straightforward, that any unnecessary delays would only complicate things, and that he needed an efficient, low-profile channel for the funds. Not a single sentence explicitly admitted to anything illegal. There was no direct acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But when you placed it right next to a forged signature, a fraudulent notary stamp, and assets about to be moved out of the country, the tone of that email completely changed. Thomas's reply was brief, just 3 sentences. He agreed. He didn't ask a single question. He just executed the order. He knew something was wrong, I said. Evelyn crossed her hands. At the very least, he ignored several glaring red flags that should have prompted obvious questions. That isn't quite the same as plotting a financial fraud from scratch, but when you participate in a transaction that turns out to be fraudulent, it creates a very serious problem. She closed the folder. I sent this to their attorney 48 hours ago. This morning, the private equity firm agreed to freeze the liquidation process and provide a full, unreserved statement of cooperation. They won't be standing in our way anymore. I asked her what this meant for Thomas and the firm moving forward. Evelyn's expression didn't change. A person facing potential federal civil liability and criminal exposure tends to become very cooperative, very quickly, especially when the alternative is explaining every single business decision to a federal grand jury under oath. She walked back to her desk and pulled something up on her screen. There's one more thing. Her tone shifted, not dramatically, but enough to make me sit up a bit straighter. When we were combing through the transaction records we've obtained so far, one detail stood out. The initial advance paid out from the winery cash-out never entered any of your joint accounts. It went directly into an offshore shell company registered solely in Richard's name. She tilted the monitor slightly toward me. An account we have no record of you ever being associated with. I stared at the screen. How long has that account existed? That, she said, is exactly what we are going to find out next. She looked up from the screen, locking her eyes onto mine. If these records are accurate, it means Richard has been funneling massive sums of money through an account you knew absolutely nothing about. The rabbit hole here might go a lot deeper than just a winery estate. The room went dead silent. Outside, right underneath the Transamerica Pyramid, San Francisco kept moving, completely unaware of the empire that was actively dismantling inside this office. I let that silence linger for just a single breath. Then I told her, dig everything up. There are some men who keep records the exact same way other men maintain weapons. It isn't out of professionalism, and it isn't out of principle. It comes from a cold, calculated awareness that one day he might need a bargaining chip to cut a deal. Jared, the underground notary who handled the forged signature for Richard, was exactly that kind of man. When his lawyer handed over 3 years of encrypted communication logs to Evelyn's office, it was the single most useful thing he had ever done in his entire life. By the time I arrived, Evelyn had all the evidence laid out across the conference table. She didn't bother greeting me at the door. She was already sitting there, meticulously piecing together the timeline. She simply looked up and said, "Sit down. You need to see this in chronological order." We started from the very beginning. The very first point of contact regarding leveraging that shared asset wasn't initiated by Richard at all. It came from a phone number registered to Thomas Vance. He called Jared's personal cell phone directly, not his office landline, not his professional email, but his personal phone. That meant Thomas had known him for a long time, and this was definitely not a cold call. The timestamp was 8 weeks before the reading of the will, a full 2 months before Richard stood in that driveway holding those divorce papers with total certainty. I sat staring at that timeline for a long time. Richard was the front man, the guy holding the paperwork and delivering the lines. But Thomas had made the very first phone call. He had set the entire plan in motion long before Richard ever took a single visible step. The communication logs that followed explained the rest. Thomas was coordinating the notary schedules, directly asking when the offshore funds would clear, and constantly pushing to speed up the process. From the very first interaction, the entire structure of this scam was covered in his fingerprints, and driving the entire operation was an assumption that neither of them ever thought to question. They assumed that whatever Aunt Margaret left behind wouldn't be enough to change anything. They took it for granted that Eleanor would only inherit a small pension, or absolutely nothing at all. They figured that by liquidating the marital assets, she would lose any leverage to fight back. They built their entire plan on total ignorance of Aunt Margaret's hand. Evelyn stopped on one specific text message. Without any build-up, she read it out loud. Eleanor usually prefers to keep the peace. I don't see her putting up much of a fight. Thomas had sent that to Jared. The timestamp was 4 weeks before the driveway confrontation. I sat completely frozen for 10 full seconds. I was subconsciously counting the seconds in my head. Then I said, add Thomas Vance as a co-defendant to the civil fraud claim, and submit all of this to the FBI. Evelyn wrote it down without saying a word. She didn't ask me to reconsider. She didn't soften the blow of what that meant. She wrote it down because it was the exact correct legal response, and we both knew it. In that exact moment, I fully understood something I had only guessed at before. This was never just about Richard wanting to end a marriage or save a failing venture capital firm. If it had been just that, it would have been painful, but it would have been ordinary human weakness. This was Richard and his own brother, working together, meticulously and methodically planning to strip away everything I had, my home, my security, and my ability to stand on my own 2 feet. They calculated the timing perfectly, building everything on 14 years of watching me shrink myself just to make everyone around me comfortable. They watched me compromise, and they counted on me to keep compromising so they could walk away with my money. Evelyn closed the communication logs and opened another window on her screen. The expanded civil conspiracy complaint will be filed this weekend, she said. But there's one more thing. She pulled up the transaction history for those hidden accounts, tracking the funds that had been moved from the offshore shell company. 14 months of bank statements. A few of the largest transfers were consistently flowing to the exact same recipient. She turned the monitor toward me, pointing to a name. I had never met her, but I recognized the name instantly, Vanessa Lane. Before I go any further into this part of the story, I want to clarify one thing. I am not the kind of woman who wastes her anger on another woman. Vanessa Lane didn't make vows to me in front of God and a room full of guests. Richard did. No matter what she knew about his marriage, disclosing the truth was his responsibility, not hers to investigate. I decided very early on exactly where to direct my focus, and I never wavered. Whatever the financial records showed about Vanessa Lane wasn't a personal grievance to me. It was evidence, and I treated it strictly as evidence. By the time Evelyn's forensic accountants showed me the full picture, they had been deep diving into that hidden account for 4 straight days. 14 months of transfers were charted and categorized. The down payment on a luxury penthouse in Miami Beach, consistent monthly mortgage payments throughout the entire period, high-end jewelry purchases, and several massive travel expenses to specific cities Richard had told me he was visiting for venture capital business trips. On top of that, there were regular monthly deposits. It didn't look like gift-giving, it looked like a budget. A household budget to maintain a lifestyle. That is the kind of structure you set up when you are building an entirely separate life, not just having a casual affair. Richard wasn't just a man cheating on his wife, he was a man actively building his ultimate escape hatch. When the forensic accountants finally calculated the grand total, it represented a massive portion of what California law defined as community property. Evelyn explained it bluntly. Deliberately wasting marital assets in anticipation of a divorce directly impacts the final division of property. She added that total sum to our claims without any hesitation. It was done as simply as adding a column of numbers that belonged there all along. Richard's lawyers pushed back in less than a week. They argued that the transfers were personal expenses and private loans between 2 consenting adults, completely unrelated to any divorce plans. His attorney made that argument in writing, and I suppose to someone who hadn't seen the discovery documents, it might have looked reasonable on paper. But Evelyn had the text messages. The conversations between Richard and Vanessa were so specific that they left absolutely zero room for ambiguity. They discussed the new life he planned to build after the divorce, the timeline he was working against, and exactly what he wanted to have secured before the dust settled. The private loan defense fell completely flat against that evidence. It collapsed the exact same week it was filed. 2 days later, Evelyn received a letter directly from an attorney representing Vanessa Lane. She read the relevant parts to me across the conference table. Ms. Vanessa Lane will not be providing testimony or statements of any kind on behalf of Mr. Richard Vance. She is not a party to these proceedings and has no intention of becoming one. The letter ended with a single line. My client considers all matters between herself and Mr. Vance to be completely and finally concluded. Completely and finally concluded. The Miami penthouse was already listed for sale. The second the hidden accounts became part of an active lawsuit and a federal investigation, the monthly deposits stopped completely. The parallel life Richard spent 14 months funding, staging, and preparing to step into vanished into thin air at a speed he never could have anticipated. And the number he was dialing now went straight to voicemail every single time. As I processed all of this, I didn't feel a rush of sweet revenge. What I felt was something much cleaner and far more useful, a complete, unfiltered, absolute clarity about exactly who Richard Vance was. He wasn't just a man who had fallen out of love. He was a man who showed up every single day to our shared life. The dinner parties, the public appearances, the ordinary Tuesdays, while quietly using my money to build a life raft for himself. That clarity didn't hurt anymore. It became my weapon. Evelyn looked up from her notes. "He's called you twice." "I know," I said. I didn't answer. "Good," she set her pen down. "Never listen to those voicemails unless I'm in the room." She paused for a moment. "He's starting to realize what he's up against. That's usually the moment they get desperate." She looked at me steadily. "Richard Vance strikes me as the kind of man who gets desperate." I took that note to heart. No matter how he reacted, I was ready. Evelyn filed the motion on Wednesday because we were less than 4 days away from that offshore funds transfer deadline. She applied for an emergency ex parte temporary restraining order. When there is an imminent documented risk of fraudulent asset transfers, federal and state courts take those mechanisms very seriously. She didn't ask for my permission before filing it. She called me afterward to tell me what she had done, what would happen next, and to tell me to keep my phone close. By Thursday morning, Richard Vance was served with 3 separate documents at the exact same time. An emergency asset freeze, an expanded civil fraud complaint naming both him and Thomas Vance as co-defendants, and a formal criminal referral prepared for the Department of Justice and the FBI's white-collar crime division, detailing forgery, wire fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. I imagined the look on his face when those papers dropped onto his desk. Then I stopped imagining it and focused entirely on the next step. The federal court hearing moved incredibly fast. The judge reviewed the leveraged property deed, the signatures flagged as forgeries, the communications surrounding the transaction, and the unreserved statement of cooperation from the private equity firm. 72 hours after Evelyn filed the application, the injunction was granted. The pending funds transfer was legally frozen. The Napa Valley Winery, which served as our primary marital home, was restored to its protected status as a joint asset, pending a full liquidation through the divorce proceedings. The date Richard had been relying on to move the money to the Cayman Islands came and went, and not a single dime changed hands. The money stayed exactly where it was. It never moved. Jared, the notary now facing civil lawsuits and parallel federal investigations, made the only calculation he could. His lawyer contacted Evelyn. Within a few days, Jared provided a comprehensive, sworn affidavit. He confirmed that Thomas had initiated the contact. He confirmed that Richard had lied about his wife consenting to the deal. He confirmed every single key fact Evelyn needed to prove the case. He was the very first domino to fall, and he fell completely. Richard's lawyers filed a counter-motion the following week, arguing that the electronic signature had been generated with verbal authorization. Reading that argument made me feel a sense of near contempt. It wasn't contempt for Richard's desperation, I could understand that. It was contempt for the assumption behind it. He actually thought a court would accept a verbal authorization in place of a legal electronic signature on a multi-million-dollar commercial property mortgage. Evelyn's written response dismantled that motion within 48 hours. The counter-motion was summarily denied. The criminal referral moved forward on its own timeline. Evelyn submitted everything: the forged signatures, the transaction logs, the witness statements, and the flow of funds charts. And then we waited. Not indefinitely, but just long enough for me to learn that the rhythm of a criminal investigation is entirely different from a civil case. A few weeks later, an agent from the white-collar crime squad at the San Francisco FBI field office contacted Evelyn, requesting an interview. I walked in there on a Thursday morning, sat across an unadorned table in an unadorned room, and gave my statement calmly and completely. I brought a copy of Aunt Margaret's letter with me, not because anyone asked for it, but because I wanted it on the record. I wanted to prove that I was standing on solid ground. Nobody could take anything away from me. From the exact moment I walked out of Arthur's office, I was standing on my own territory. The original letter stayed in my bag. It had been there since the day Arthur handed it to me, and I saw no reason to change that. Richard called my cell phone that afternoon. This time I answered. Evelyn sat right next to me, and the call was on speakerphone with Richard's knowledge. He sounded like a man who hadn't slept in days. There was a distinct frailty in his voice, the kind that comes from a long lack of rest combined with the realization that the game is completely up. He told me that he had made a mistake. I told him I agreed with that statement. I thanked him for calling, and I hung up the phone. Evelyn gave me a single nod. That was enough. Later that evening, Arthur called. The probate process for Margaret's estate was moving much faster than the standard timeline. He expected the title for the historic Pacific Heights mansion to be transferred into my name within 3 weeks. I set the phone down and looked out the window of Sarah's guest room. I had been staying here since the day of the confrontation in the driveway. My personal belongings had been retrieved from the Palo Alto house the previous week by a team Evelyn put together. I didn't need to go back myself. I didn't need to stand in those rooms ever again. I looked out at the San Francisco Bay at night, and suddenly, a 3-week wait felt incredibly close. The probate process officially concluded on a Tuesday. Arthur called at 8:14 in the morning. I knew the exact time because I had been awake since 6, staring at my phone, refusing to admit to myself that I was waiting for the call. When it finally rang, I let it ring twice before answering. It was an old habit, keeping up appearances. He told me the keys were ready. He asked if I wanted him to come along with me. I told him no, I wanted to go there by myself for the first time. I had driven past that house many times before, though not recently. When I was younger, Aunt Margaret would sometimes drive me through Pacific Heights on Sunday afternoons without explaining a thing. She never directly pointed at the house. She would just slow the car down, letting me look, and once I had seen enough, she would drive on. Back then, I was too young and simply accepted it without question. But now, I was old enough to realize she was showing me something she wasn't quite ready to put into words. Over the years, I often thought back to those drives during quiet moments. In my marriage, those quiet moments were the only spaces that belonged entirely to me. Now, as I pulled into the driveway and shifted the car into park, those days came back to me again. I sat there for a few minutes, just sitting. Then I got out, walked up to the front entrance, and slid the key into the lock. The door opened, and the scent hit me before anything else. It smelled of lemon oil, old books, and cedar wood, and beneath all of that, a stillness that didn't feel empty, but beautifully preserved. It was the unique atmosphere of a place that had been deeply cared for over a long period of time, because the person watching over it understood that love is largely about maintenance, presence, and attention, not letting things fall apart. It smelled exactly like Margaret. I had told Sarah where I was going. My phone was in my pocket, but there was absolutely nothing here that required me to stay on high alert. There were only the rooms that had been waiting for me all along. I walked slowly through each room. The front parlor featured high Victorian windows. The dining room chairs were perfectly arranged, as if someone had just stood up from the table. The kitchen was functional, clean, and highly organized, which was exactly how Margaret structured everything. She possessed an absolute confidence about where every single item belonged. I slid my hand over the marble countertop, feeling a heavy concrete sadness about how much of my own life I had spent accommodating certainty defined by someone else, rather than building my own. I had spent 14 years making myself smaller, so gradually and carefully that I hadn't even realized the full extent of my own compromise until I stood in a house where nobody was asking me to shrink. I found the library and study at the end of the hall. This was where she used to work. It had a dark wood desk, floor-to-ceiling architecture books, and her leather armchair with worn armrests facing the window and the street below. Sitting on the desk, in a simple wooden frame that had clearly been there for years, was a photograph. I picked it up. It was me, probably 26 or 27, wearing my graduation gown right after receiving my master's degree in architecture. I was standing in front of a building we had designed together, squinting into the sunlight, my entire face lit up as I laughed at someone just outside the frame. I turned the frame over. Margaret's handwriting was there. Tidy, slightly slanted, and resolute. She doesn't know it yet, but this belongs to her. Beneath it was a date, 15 years ago. I sat down in her chair. And for the first time since that afternoon in the private driveway, after all the meetings, the paperwork, the grinding of the legal machine, and the carefully controlled breathing, I finally cried. It wasn't out of pain, and it wasn't out of grief. It was the overwhelming relief of letting your guard down completely when you are fully seen and understood by someone. She had mapped out the entire outline of my life before I even fully understood it myself. She wrote it down, framed it, and left it on her desk, exactly where I would find it one day. I sat with that feeling for a long time. Then I pulled out my phone and called Clara. She picked up on the second ring. "I'm in Margaret's study," I said, "in Pacific Heights." There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "She always said you'd find your way back there." I looked out the window at the street below. The exact street where she used to slow down the car just to let me look at this house. "Tell me when you can make it over," I said. "I want to show you every single room." I didn't actually watch Richard's downfall happen in real time. The news reached me the way you hear a weather report about a city you used to live in, without any sense of urgency. That is how information arrives when it no longer has the power to hurt you. Evelyn would call to update me on the progress. Clara would tell me about the rumors still circulating in her social circle. I listened to all of it the exact same way, carefully, completely, and never letting the information occupy more space than it deserved. Before any formal charges were even filed, the news of the civil lawsuit and the referral to the federal criminal investigation had already spread like wildfire through Richard's professional circle. That is exactly how Silicon Valley networking works. A publicly filed federal fraud complaint and a formal referral letter to a white-collar crime unit travel faster than any press release. Questions Richard had never needed to answer before started popping up everywhere. Two of the core limited partner relationships Richard spent years cultivating in the venture capital world grew noticeably cold in less than a week. There were no arguments, no explanations, just postponed phone calls, pushed meetings, and the deliberate distance people create when they aren't sure what's going to happen next. A man who built his entire identity on how he presented himself to the world was watching his carefully maintained image develop cracks he had absolutely no power to fix. The statement of cooperation from the head of that private equity firm became a part of the public civil record. His statement left zero room for interpretation. Richard was the primary mastermind. As the lenders, they maintained they had been entirely misled regarding the authorization. They reached a civil settlement, provided their testimony, and walked away from the wreckage they helped create. Richard was left with absolutely nobody to share the weight. Every single person who had a hand in the transaction was either pointing a finger at him as a cooperating witness or vanishing entirely. Then, Richard made one final attempt to regain control. Before any formal settlement talks even began, his lawyers sent a proposal to Evelyn. It painted everything as a massive misunderstanding. The forged signature issue was described as a dispute over document handling. The hidden accounts were categorized as personal investment expenses. If I agreed to a low-profile divorce and dropped the civil claims, Richard was prepared to offer what his lawyers called a reasonable financial settlement. Evelyn looked over the proposal and handed it across the desk to me. "What do you think?" she asked. I read through it carefully. 14 years of marriage, forged documents, hidden funds, a winery nearly lost to liquidation, and somehow this proposal still treated me like a woman who could be easily managed and quieted down. I handed it back. "No." Evelyn nodded once. "I figured." The proposal expired 3 days later. Right after that, Thomas hired his own independent counsel. Evelyn told me about it on a Wednesday morning in her usual level tone, but I understood what it meant instantly. Thomas's lawyer submitted a statement within days, completely separating his role from Richard's on a formal legal level. The filing characterized Thomas's involvement as strictly administrative execution, while naming Richard as the core decision-maker. Thomas offered to provide limited cooperation in the civil lawsuit, his own flesh and blood, the chief financial officer who had actively helped him set up that ambush in the first place. The very second this illegal house of cards began to collapse, Thomas hired his own lawyer and immediately pointed the finger straight at his older brother. Thomas's settlement agreement was negotiated entirely on its own. He paid his share of the civil damages, and through his attorney, provided a written confirmation admitting to his role in initiating contact with Jared, the underground notary. The wording of that document wasn't an apology. It was written as a legally binding statement of facts, but it will follow him forever, in court records, in permanent archives, and in any future background check that digs into these events. He had wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing. Instead, he left himself with a permanent record of his own disgrace. I had made a mental note of the way my cousins, David and Chloe, stormed out of Arthur's office on the day of the will reading. In the weeks that followed, they had quietly aligned themselves with the narrative Richard was trying to spin. I heard about it through Clara, who picked it up from the small social circle that connects San Francisco's oldest families. They clearly thought Richard's version of events was going to be more profitable for them at the time. But Richard's narrative no longer had any structural support. Their loyalty bought them absolutely nothing, except for tying their names to a man staring down a growing legal and financial abyss. I noted their choice, and then I simply moved on with my life. I lived in Margaret's house. I had rooms that needed to be lived in, decisions that required my attention, and a completely separate life to rebuild entirely on my own terms. Richard Vance's world was shrinking drastically day by day, and I was under no obligation to watch it collapse. Evelyn called on a Friday afternoon. His attorney reached out to me, she said. Informal settlement talks. He wants to negotiate before the divorce court proceedings go any further. She paused for a second. He sees the whole picture now. He knows exactly what he's facing. I asked her how she wanted to handle it. Get him to the negotiating table, she said. Put him right across from us and lay everything out in plain sight. Let him look at exactly what he is up against with witnesses in the room. I told her, set it up. Evelyn called on a Monday morning, and before saying another word, she delivered a single sentence. I need Sarah's deposition. She explained what she needed, a formal sworn affidavit covering the reading of the will, the drive home, and everything Sarah witnessed in that private driveway. Before I even hung up with Evelyn, I was already dialing Sarah's number. She picked up, and before I could even finish explaining, she said, "Tell me when and where." She had just been waiting for me to ask. Evelyn was incredibly cautious about one specific detail. She didn't want me in the room when Sarah gave her statement. She wanted Sarah's account to be completely uninterrupted, independent, and drawn strictly from her own observations, without any subconscious temptation to align her story with the version I had already told her. I understood her logic and agreed without a second thought. I sat in Evelyn's waiting area for 2 full hours while my sister and a litigation assistant sat in the conference room, writing down everything she saw. When the printed statement was finally placed in my hands, I read it slowly. Sarah had always been a sharp observer, quieter than me, and much more precise in the way she categorized things. We had been sisters our entire lives, and I had always known this about her. But until that moment, I hadn't fully realized just how much detail she had absorbed on a day when I thought I was the only one paying attention. The first major detail came from the driveway. Sarah noticed that as she pulled up to the curb, Thomas was holding a cell phone to his ear, looking like he was in the final seconds of a conversation. It was the body language of someone preparing to hang up, rather than someone just standing around. By the time I stepped out of the car, the phone was already down by his side. Sarah caught that movement and remembered the timing with extreme precision, because it felt incredibly deliberate and coordinated, like a co-conspirator who had just confirmed a piece of intelligence and was now stepping into his designated position. In isolation, it was a tiny detail. But in context, it tied Thomas directly to someone on the other end of that line, potentially a lawyer, the notary, or another involved party. At the exact moment the ambush was about to be executed, he wasn't just standing there supporting his brother, he was managing the final confirmation of the entire operation, right until I stepped out of a vehicle he didn't recognize, and their plan started to unravel. The second detail surprised Sarah herself. While giving the statement, Evelyn's assistant asked a standard question. Looking back at the years leading up to Margaret's passing, did anything feel out of the ordinary? Sarah thought about that question for a long time. Then she remembered something neither of us had thought about in years. About 3 years ago, during a Thanksgiving family gathering, she had stepped out of the main living room to take a phone call. Before she could make a sound, she accidentally overheard a fragment of a conversation between Richard and Thomas. It wasn't much, certainly not enough to understand the full context, just broken phrases that meant absolutely nothing at the time. Thomas mentioned hearing a rumor that Margaret Vance was restructuring some of her trusts and assets. Richard responded, "I'll handle it." Then, after a pause, Richard added one more thing. "If she's moving assets around, I need to know what changed. I can't have anything messing with my pipeline." The only reason Sarah remembered it now was because sitting in Evelyn's office, watching everything play out, those few words sounded completely different than they did 3 years ago. Evelyn added her own handwritten note right underneath this section of the statement. This memory, on its own, doesn't serve as direct evidence of a crime, but when placed alongside the documented evidence, the timelines, the asset transfers, and the communication logs, it helps explain exactly when and why Richard's behavior began to shift during that period. It was context, not a smoking gun, but when the rest of the structure is already standing firm, context becomes everything. I set the statement down. 3 years ago. That meant the timeline aligned perfectly with the exact shift I had noticed in Richard during our 11th year of marriage. The shifting of funds, the careful questions about my aunt's assets, the silences that felt like a man calculating his escape. It hadn't been a rough patch in his career. It was his reaction to the intelligence he had gathered. He had caught wind of my aunt's estate planning, and to protect his failing venture capital empire while securing his own future, he had started moving. The one question I had secretly carried with me, whether Richard had ever truly loved me, or if he had just changed over time, vanished completely. That conference room was Evelyn's territory in every single sense of the word. Her space, her floor, her table. That massive, dark table was intentionally arranged to make anyone sitting on the opposite end vividly aware that they were a guest in someone else's house. When Evelyn and I walked in, Richard and his lawyer were already seated. I noticed it instantly. They had arrived early and taken the far side, which meant they had been sitting there waiting for us. And being the one left waiting always carries a specific psychological cost. For the first time since that afternoon in the private driveway, I sat directly across from Richard Vance. He looked older, not in a dramatic or completely broken way, but he had that distinct look of a man who hadn't slept well in a very long time. He had spent too many hours alone with the reality he had created for himself. The absolute certainty in his posture was gone. In its place was a sharp anxiety, carefully masked as composure. Evelyn skipped the opening remarks and went straight to the point. Full, unencumbered title to the Napa Valley Winery as part of the settlement terms, a heavily disproportionate division of the community property to reflect the intentional dissipation of assets. The total amount of hidden funds calculated by the forensic accountants was put on the record and was completely indisputable. A massive transfer of Richard's personal shares in his venture capital fund, and resolving the civil fraud claims through a settlement rather than heading to trial. There was one more element that wasn't even placed on the table, because it wasn't a bargaining chip Evelyn had the power to offer. The criminal referral to the Department of Justice would move entirely on its own trajectory, completely separate from any document signed in this room today. Richard's lawyer pushed back on 2 specific points, the numbers for the asset division and the percentage of the stock transfer. Evelyn responded to each objection using the documented evidence already on the record. For the first point, she presented the forensic accountant's final report. For the second, she referenced the communication logs that established the intentional fraud scheme. Their struggle lasted for exactly 11 minutes, and then it was over. Richard didn't say a single word during the entire process. He stared down at the table. He occasionally looked over at his lawyer. He didn't look at me once. And then he did. He turned directly toward me, ignoring Evelyn and the paperwork entirely. He looked straight at me and said, "I never intended for things to get to this point." I let him finish his sentence. Then I looked back at him calmly and said, "I believe you. Of course you never intended for things to get to this point. You intended for me to break down in that driveway, sign those papers, and make your escape incredibly easy." I kept my voice perfectly level. "The only reason things got to this point is because I didn't break." He had absolutely nothing to say to that. He turned his eyes back down to the table. His lawyer signed first, and then Richard. The way the pen slid across the signature line looked exactly how any inevitable conclusion looks when it finally arrives. There was no drama, just a quiet, permanent end.